Leading our discussion today is John Malcolm. John serves as the Ed Gilbertson and Sherry Lindbergh Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow at Heritage. He is also director of the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Prior to joining Heritage, he held a variety of positions, including serving as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. He was an Executive Vice President in charge of anti-piracy operations at the Motion Picture Association of America, and he has served as a General Counsel at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, John Malcolm. John?
Thank you, John. Our guest today, Bernard Kerik, has seen the criminal justice system from a vantage point that few of us have seen. Mr. Kerik has been at the pinnacle of the law enforcement community. Having started out as a military police officer and a beat cop, he rose through the ranks to corrections commissioner, where he was credited with significantly improving what had once been thought an ungovernable prison, Rikers Island. He then served as New York City's top cop, the police commissioner, where his duties included, for example, overseeing the NYPD's response to the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers. He was one of New York City's most decorated police officers. Among the many awards that he has received were 30 medals for excellent, meritorious, and heroic service. Mr. Kerik served as a national security advisor to King Abdullah of Jordan and was appointed by President Bush to be the interim interior minister of the Iraq Coalition Provisional Authority. And of course, he was subsequently nominated by President Bush in 2004 to head the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Kerik has also served time in federal prison. After withdrawing his nomination, the federal government initiated an investigation against Mr. Kerik, which culminated in his pleading guilty to 8 charges, including criminal conspiracy, tax fraud, and lying under oath. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and served most of that time. He has now written an account of his triumphs, his challenges, and his ordeals. It is From Jailer to Jailed, copies of which, by the way, are available in the lobby, and Mr. Kerik will be happy to sign them at the conclusion of this event. Mr. Kerik will now make some brief opening remarks, then he and I will engage in a moderated dialogue with each other, and after that we'll have time permitting some questions from the audience. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bernard Kerik.
Good morning. First, I want to thank John and the Heritage Foundation for the invitation to be here and speak to you and speak about the book. As John mentioned, I've been a cop, I've been a correctional officer, I've been a federal drug agent. I was the warden of a county jail in New Jersey. And then for 6 years, I oversaw Rikers Island, which at the time was one of the most violent jail systems in the nation. In a 6-year period, I took it from one of the most violent, mismanaged jail and prison systems in our country to an international model for efficiency, accountability, and safety. We averaged 150 stabbings and slashings per month when I took over. On the month I became police commissioner in the year 2000, we had 1, a 93% reduction in violence, and there were efficiencies in every area of management within the system. In the year 2000, I became police commissioner, and it was smooth sailing. Violence was down, crime was down in the city, everything was going fine until 8:46 on the morning of September 11th. It was the most trying time for the NYPD, one of the darkest days in our country's history. But for me, as bad as it was, I got to witness the best and the worst in humanity. The worst being the men that flew those planes into the towers, into Shanksville and the Pentagon, and the best in watching the rescue mission, which I consider one of the greatest and most substantial rescue missions in the history of our country, carried out by the men and women in the New York City Police Department, Fire Department, and the Port Authority Police. From that point on, my career in public service was sort of straight uphill until I was nominated by the president. And I have to tell you, I thought I knew our criminal justice system. I thought I knew it better than just about anyone until I was actually a target of federal prosecutors, and I found myself in a federal prison. And I came to realize quickly that our criminal justice system, in my opinion, is flawed and failed in many ways. So I'll sum it up with a couple things that I found most important to me. I think the sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimums that we live by in the federal system today have to be repealed, revamped, or abolished. I think judges have to have the ability to judge. I think we are putting way too many people with mental illness and addiction in prison. They need treatment. They don't need prison. I think we're taking young men, first-time, nonviolent offenders, and this is one of the things that struck me the most when I went into prison. I put a lot of people in prison, bad people that did bad things. And I believe in law and order, and I am no different today of a law and order type person than I was 20 years ago. And I put people in prison that wanted to kill me, that killed men I work with, people I seized tons of cocaine from, millions in drug proceeds. And then I went to prison and I met young black men, 18, 19 years old, 5 grams of cocaine, 2 sugar packs in a Dunkin' Donuts shop, 10 years, 15 years in prison because they were tacked on to some third party, fourth party conspiracy. I met commercial fishermen that caught too many fish or the wrong size fish. I met a guy that sold a whale's tooth on eBay. Young men that enhanced their income in a mortgage application to buy their first home. Federal prison. Thousands upon thousands of people are in federal prison for these offenses. And the one thing I've come to realize, and I think that the general public, I am absolutely confident that the general public doesn't know, is that we are creating a permanent underclass of American citizen in this country, a second-class citizen, by the millions. Because once you become a convicted felon, you are a second-class citizen until the day you die. That conviction never goes away. Your debt to society is never paid, ever. We are supposed to incarcerate and rehabilitate. We are supposed to punish and make people better, pay for their crimes, pay for their mistakes, get them back into society a better person. I promise you, that's not happening. If we didn't have the advocacy groups around this country that we do today, like the Heritage Foundation and others, thousands of others, I can't even tell you how bad society would be. In many cases, especially in these low-level, first-time, nonviolent offender drug cases, society has failed these young men and women. Their families have failed them. Their communities have failed them. And then we stick them in prison for 10 years and 15 years, and we fail them again. We shouldn't have an option for failure once we take over, and we fail them completely. They're supposed to have programs to benefit them, and I can assure you, where I was, we had adult continuing education programs. But as I stand here, and these are real examples, knitting, crocheting, chess, checkers, they're not going to do anything for recidivism, reducing recidivism. We take people that are convicted of real estate fraud, we engage them in a prison to teach a real estate class to other convicted felons. There's 2 problems I have with that. One, You're letting someone teach the very topic for which they were convicted. It's a bit of a hypocrisy. Worse than that is that once they teach these people, they're supposed to be teaching them something that helps them for when they get on the outside. You can teach them to be a master realtor. They can't get a job as a real estate agent. You can teach them to be an accountant. They can't get a job as an accountant because they're convicted felon. And that's the last thing, and this is probably one of the most important issues that I see going forward in this country. The collateral consequence of a conviction in this country is personally and professionally annihilating for the rest of your life. Very far and few between do people come out of a federal prison or after a felony conviction and have any sort of success, unless they're entrepreneurial or unless they have some special skill. But the collateral consequences that come with a conviction are completely annihilating. And we have to do something about that. At some point in time, you have to pay your debt to society. Your debt is paid. You're paid up in full. And your civil and constitutional rights should be given back to you. Because as it stands today, that never happens, ever. You lose civil and constitutional rights that are never given back. You are never made whole again as an American citizen, no matter what you do. And I'll give you a first-hand example. I was with a young man. He was 21 years old. He was a United States Marine sniper. He had a pair of night vision goggles, his own personal night vision goggles. He sold them on eBay. He was convicted in a conspiracy because the person he sold them to didn't have the appropriate permit to sell them abroad. The kid was 21. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison. 30 months, because he did something he didn't even know was wrong. That being said, if that kid lives to be 120 and he's a complete angel on the outside once he gets out of prison, he's still going to have the collateral consequence of that conviction lying over his head until the day they put him in the ground. It's wrong. We were founded by a constitution, by a governing body, by our founding fathers who said the punishment is supposed to fit the crime. Today, in the American government, the punishments do not fit the crime, and that has to change. Thank you.
Bernie, why don't you stay at the podium, and I'll just keep my voice up and ask you questions from here, since we don't have microphones here. So, it's quite a remarkable book. So you went from being, one of the nation's top cops to being a federal inmate, which is quite a fall. And this was obviously a very, very difficult book for you to write. The pain that you felt is evident on virtually every page in the book. And so I'm curious, why did you write this book?
A lot of people, when I wrote the book, especially critics, they come out, he's writing the book to make money. He's writing the book to make up for losses. I have to tell you, and I heard this line once, and I couldn't agree more. For the losses I've had over the last 8 to 10 years as a result of the investigation of my conviction, that book would have to sell more copies than the Bible for me to make up for it. This isn't about money. This is basically about an education. When I said earlier that I'm confident that the American public doesn't know the things that I've learned, I said that for a reason. I know they don't know, and I'm positive that many of the legislators, the actual people that write our laws, they don't know either. And I know that because I didn't know. I didn't know. I run two of the biggest organizations in this country, the biggest law enforcement organizations in this nation. I did not know many of the things that I've learned since. And if I didn't know, I'm sure that the American public doesn't know. So that's what the book is about. I think the book is an educating tool for the American public, and I think I want it to create the debate that has to be created to change the laws. If every American citizen in this country read the book, they'd have to come away with one primary question, and that would be go to your legislator and ask them, how is it that we in this country are 5% of the world's population. The United States as a whole is 5% of the world's population, yet we hold 25% of the world's prisoners. How is that possible? There has to be some. How do we have more prisoners than Russia and China? There's something wrong, and I think the book will open up eyes to create that debate.
So in your book, you quote from a fellow prisoner as describe prison as, quote, like dying with your eyes open. Can you just please describe a little bit what you mean by that?
If I heard that statement prior to my incarceration, I wouldn't have had a clue what that meant. I would have had no idea. But I had been there for months, I think at the time, maybe a few months already, when this kid made this statement. And we were having a conversation one afternoon, and he had enormous problems. His wife had been diagnosed with cancer. He was there on a first-time low-level drug charge. He tried to get a compassionate release. He couldn't get it. He tried to get to the hospital where his wife was. He couldn't get it. He had nobody else to take care of his kids. I mean, it was a mess. And he was basically standing there, and he said to me, he said, "This is like dying with your eyes open." And it knotted up in my stomach like nothing before, because I knew exactly what he meant. When you go to prison, I don't care who it is, unless you're an institutionalized animal, when you go to prison, that's what happens. You die with your eyes open. You are placed in a stagnant position, and you watch everything go on around you in your family, your personal life, your professional life, everything. Everything goes on without you in it. And no matter how bad it can be, and I had some really bad incidents happen to my family, events happen to my family while I was inside. One, my brother-in-law went to the hospital for a routine surgery, a very routine surgery. He was supposed to be in and out in a day. He never left the hospital. He died. He was 50 years old. He had 3 sons that were 13 years old, triplets. And there wasn't anything I could do for him, his family, his wife. And it was horrible. A few months later, my son, who was a police officer in Newark, New Jersey, his partner was shot and killed during a robbery. I have had the unfortunate, I've been in the unfortunate position to bury more cops than anyone in this country as a police chief or a commissioner. But I couldn't be there for my son when his partner died. I know what that kid meant when he said it's like dying with your eyes open, and that's what it's about.
So you mentioned your family, and in the book you talk something about the ordeal that this took on your family. Your wife Hala, your son Joe, your daughters Celine and Angelina. Can you describe a little bit more about sort of how they coped and the difficulties they had, and also how they're doing now?
When you go to prison, as I said, your life stands still. Yours does. Theirs don't. And there's the reverse. Everything they do, it doesn't have you in it. So your children, school events, report cards, sporting events, you name it, the good, the bad, the ugly, it all goes on without you in it. There's distance that's created between your kid, your children, your spouse. And none of it is good. None of it's good. I left, my 2 daughters were 7 and 10. I came back, they were 10 and 13. They were adults, almost adults in my eyes when I came back. They were completely different. You come back to the same home you left, it's a very different house. It's a very different home. You come back to the same spouse you left, very different relationship. There's nothing good about that distance. Not to mention that the financial problems that occur, lack of income, I can't tell you, and I am and was one of the fortunate ones that I know. I cannot tell you how many men were taken out of the workforce, and I'll give you one pretty easy example. The commercial fishermen that caught too many fish, there were a few where I was. And this is one of the problems I have with the system. Instead of dealing with that guy through a regulatory body, which it should have been, what we did is we turned him into a convicted felon. He lost his boat. The 6 people on the boat lost their job. His wife worked for the company. She was left alone. He went to prison. Now he gets out of prison 18 months later. He has nowhere to go. The boat's gone. The company's gone. He can't get a license. The only thing he's done since he was 17 years old was fish. He was 55. What's he going to do for the rest of his life? I don't know. But what I can tell you is there are thousands of cases like that, disrupting the economy, disrupting families, destroying families, putting people on public assistance. And who pays for that stuff? You do, the American taxpayer. It's your loss. And it's costing us billions, if not trillions of dollars over the reported cost of incarceration.
You also mentioned how being charged with a crime and ultimately convicted affected your relationship with your close friend, your former boss and partner, Rudy Giuliani. I was wondering when, and obviously you had other friends, I'm sure, where these happenings impacted on that relationship. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about that.
The Mayor Giuliani and I were, I worked for him for 8 years in the police department. I had known him for 2 years prior to that. Once I retired from the NYPD, we had a company together, a consulting group. We were very close. He was my boss, my partner. He was also the godfather to my 2 youngest daughters. When the investigation started, the federal investigations, there was distance we created between us mutually. And it was understood. I didn't want him involved in my case, and he didn't want the focus and the attention that was coming down on me on him, especially at that time he was running for president. He announced he was going to run for president. I understood that. What happened later was, in the aftermath of my conviction, and I was sent to prison, I never heard from him again, nor did my kids. And I get, look, if he didn't want to speak to me or that distance, he wanted to continue that distance, that's fine. But I don't think there's anybody in American government that doesn't understand the pain that comes to a family when somebody is incarcerated than a U.S. attorney or former U.S. attorney. I would have hoped he was there for my children in my absence, and he wasn't, and that was painful. But it's behind me, and so be it.
Yeah, I suppose in circumstances like that, you find out who your friends are. Now, you're still under probation for another year, as I recall. What are some of the current restrictions that you face, and what are the additional restrictions that you're going to face in the future?
The primary restrictions, travel restrictions, constant oversight by the Department of Probation. And look, they have an enormous job to do. They have a difficult job to do, the Department of Probation, in overseeing people that were in the system. My problem that I have with the system is that I think there has to be an evaluation process where people that are a real threat of getting back involved in crime, you have to stay on top of them. But then there's a whole bunch of people, thousands of people, that wind up on supervised release. They're not a threat to recidivism. They're not a threat to society. They're not a threat of violence. And the probation officers could, be better served by, focusing on people that's really problematic. So that's where I find, I have differences of opinion on who we supervise and for how long. But I will tell you, regardless of my own circumstance, companies don't want to hire people that's on probation because you don't want probation officers showing up at your work. You don't want probation officers showing up at your company. You don't want that oversight. You don't want the government looking at you in any way. So the supervised release program, the probation program, is needed in many aspects. But when it's not needed, it should be, the releasee should be granted a real release so that they can really go get a job and do something productive instead of sitting around doing nothing and having that hamper them and hinder them in trying to have a successful return into society.
I'm going to put my glasses to this because I'm going to read a somewhat extensive quote. So first, in your book, you quoted an old cliche that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged, and a liberal is a conservative who's been indicted. But then you said the following, and which I must say is, for you being a former well-known law enforcement officer who put a lot of people behind bars, I found this passage rather eye-opening. You said, quote, "Our courts are over-punishing decent people who make mistakes, and our prisons have no rewards or incentives for good behavior. In this alone, our criminal justice and prison systems contradict their own mission statements. For 30 years, I believed the system was honest and fair, and in some ways I still do. But after experiencing firsthand from the other side its flaws, failures, and injustices, I tell you that it's not only wrong, but dangerous for every American and the future of this country. There is no greater threat to a free and democratic nation than a government that fails to protect its citizens' freedoms and liberty as aggressively as it pursues justice." What did you mean by this?
Like I said, I thought I knew the system. I thought we punish bad people that do bad things. What I didn't realize is that we also take people that violated a regulatory rule or a civil issue or an administrative issue, and we prosecute them criminally. I didn't understand that. I never witnessed it. I didn't know it existed, really, until I was actually on the inside and got to talk to people. I heard case after case after case and read, forget the stuff I read on the inside, the stuff that I started to realize on the outside in the arena of prosecutions, especially in the federal prosecutions. Prosecutorial misconduct is on the increase at staggering numbers, so much so that we recently had a judge, I think out on the West Coast, and I don't recall his name, that banished an entire United States Attorney's Office for misconduct. And here's my problem. When I talk about governments, the protecting the liberties and freedoms of people that make mistakes, they can be mistakes. Not everybody's a bad guy. Not everybody's a criminal. Not everybody has criminal intent. We've evolved into a society right now where nobody can make a mistake. If you make a mistake, it's criminal, and the punishment is prison. I can assure you prison's not necessary in every case for people to pay for their mistakes or learn from their mistakes. I can assure you that the amount of time people's been given for those mistakes in many cases, it's not a laughing matter, but I used to wonder, like, who's the person in the Sentencing Commission or in the U.S. government that determines, like, 10 years is a better of a sentence than 5? Because what I'm curious to know is, what do they think happens within that extra 5-year period that didn't happen in the first 5? Somebody sentenced to a year and a day versus 5 years. I'm sure that they never lived within an institution, because I can tell you, a day is like a week. A week is like a year. A year is like 10. And you don't know that. You don't get it unless you're on the inside. I spent 60 days in solitary confinement, strict solitary confinement, surrounded by a bunch of terrorists. And I can tell you that 60 days to me was like 10 years. So I believe that we overpunish. I believe that the people that impose these sentences have no conception what time really is on the inside. And as far as rewards for good behavior, we've had the Second Chance Act. We've had a number of laws that have been put on the books to get guys, men and women, out of the system faster if they behave themselves. Well, I can tell you, I'm one of them. I was put in for extra halfway house time to get out sooner. I was denied. And I know many other people that were put in, they were denied as well. Nobody leaves the system earlier than they're supposed to, no matter how good you are. I knew an inmate that had 4 different jobs within the BOP, did everything he was supposed to, never had an inmate infraction, not one thing. The model prisoner didn't get 1 day off, didn't get one benefit in the system than one of the most rogue thugs running around the compound in which we lived. It's wrong. We talk about being a country that is one of second chances. There are no second chances. Not once you're a convicted felon. There's not.
So you've made reference to some of the people who you met in prison, and you dealt with a broad array of people. You were interacting with drug dealers. You developed a relationship with Jack Abramoff, the infamous lobbyist who was convicted of bribery. I'm curious, sort of, what differences and similarities did you see among the inmates, and what lessons did you take away from them?
I think most importantly, families and children. I think if there's similarities in most of the people that I was with, the one thing that everybody had, everybody was sort of alike. It was their concern for the kids. I didn't meet many men, even the guys that, you know, the sort of the drug thugs that I would call them. And some of these guys they'd been in the system for 25 years, 20 years. And they had come down in time to the point that they were finally allowed to be in a minimum security camp. You have to be under 10 years to get into a camp. These guys had been in the system for 20, 25 years. And ironically, nonviolent. They had a nonviolent offense, or they couldn't get into a camp. And many of them, first-time offenders. 20, 25 years within the system. But they were still concerned with their kids. They were still concerned with family members. I think that was the area where many of us were alike. Everybody had political differences. Everybody had differences of opinion. But I think the thing that we focused on most was our children. And I think the reason being is your kids are alone in life without you. There's nothing you can do to help them. Nothing. When I say dying with your eyes open, I mean it. I don't care what happens. I don't care how small they are. I don't care what their needs are. If your spouse or your family can't help them, they are doomed. And that is why we see so many kids that have parents in prison that wind up coming into prison themselves because there was nobody there for them. And I believe that.
So you really got to see the common humanity of people, or at least that everybody had that familial connection. Let me ask you one other question, then I'll leave some time for questions from the audience. So in the book you said, quote, every prosecutor, judge, correction officer, and jail and prison official should have to spend 72 hours in the hole, meaning solitary confinement, to see what it's like. I'm curious, if you could go back in time, what advice would the Bernard Kerik of today give to the Bernard Kerik who was the New York City Police Commissioner and head of corrections at Rikers Island?
And I think I said this in the book, that wasn't just a thought. If I was running Rikers Island today, a part of the training curriculum would be for every CO, every single CO that goes through the Correction Academy would have to spend 72 hours in solitary. I would make that a mandatory portion of their training for a few reasons, one of which you need to know what it's like for the people on the inside. So when you're on the outside and you have to respond to them, or you have to deal with them, or you have to respond to an emergency, you need to know what's going on, what they're thinking, why they're thinking what they are. Because at the end of the day, I can tell you, I was in a cell that was 12 by 8. It had a 4 by 6 cot in it, so really you're in a cell that's 12 by 4. I was in that cell for 60 days, 24 hours a day. I was let out 3 times a week to take a shower, and that's it. There was no contact with the outside world except for one phone call, one 15-minute phone call a month. No communications with the outside world except for mail, which took forever. In that 60-day period, I found myself hallucinating, talking to myself. People have asked me, how'd you get through it? I counted. That's the only thing I can remember, I can think of. I counted. I counted the steps from one end of the wall to the other. I counted the bed springs in the bunk bed overhead of me. There was nobody in it, but I used to count those springs up and down to see if I could come up with the same number over and over. I counted the cracks in the walls. I counted the lines on the windows. I counted the mud splats on the windows, for God's sakes. You have no conception of what it's like in solitary. And the people that man our jails and prisons in this country, they have one of the most dangerous jobs. They have a thankless job, but I can assure you they have a job in which they have no conception of what it's like to be on the inside of that cell. And I think every one of them should know. And the other thing, when I talked about the prosecutors and judges, you watch this from this point on, and you probably have never paid attention to this, but I'd like you to look at it going forward. When you see somebody was arrested for a crime, whatever the crime may be, and you hear that that person has been placed in solitary confinement, and then all of a sudden the person pleads guilty, I'm going to tell you, you'll do anything to get out of that cell, anything. You'll say anything, you'll do anything, you'll admit to anything, and that should be a contributing factor to every judge's decision and every prosecutor's motive behind what they do and how they do it, and every judge's decision on whether they accept the plea of guilty from somebody that's in solitary. I can tell you, you will do anything to get out of that cell.
Yeah, it was interesting in your book, you talk about a number of the corrections officers whom you interacted with, and some you thought were really professional and did their job well and were a credit to the profession, others decidedly less so. With that, let's open it up to questions from the audience. I would ask, when you get handed the microphone, that you tell your name and your affiliation, keep it short, and end it with a question mark. And with that, why don't we start with Paul in the back.
Mr. Kerik, you were the director of the New York City Department of Corrections and the New York City Police Commissioner, and you say you didn't know truly what it was like on the inside. How can the average member of the public who works in a field that has no relation to the criminal justice system come to learn what you've learned? How can the public be educated about the things you've learned when they don't have remotely the experience that you had with the system?
There's a couple things, Paul, and honestly, I think about this all the time because the numbers, I remember, 20, 30 years ago when I got in law enforcement, 30 years ago, not many people at all knew anything about the criminal justice system. Me being a cop, not many people knew what my job was. Not many people that I knew 30 years ago knew anyone that had ever been in prison. I can tell you honestly, those numbers have changed substantially. Today, and I know this, I know it even more since I've gotten out, because I get flooded with email responses that come to my work website from people that have experienced some of the stuff that I talk about, not themselves, but through family members. The unfortunate thing is, it's hard for anyone to understand, anyone, what goes on within the system, what the prosecutions are like, what the investigations are like, what the process is like, the mere cost to somebody. And let me put it this way, and I talk about this in my book. One of the things that I've learned that people would find maybe confusing or upsetting, and I think I sum it up this way in the book. You don't have the constitutional rights you think you have unless you have the money to pay for them. And I want you to think about that, because the reality is there are so many people in prison that didn't have the money to pay for a real attorney or to file an appeal for their conviction or their sentencing or whatever the case may be. The legal cost in this world today are astronomical. I was billed $100,000, $150,000, sometime $200,000 per month for almost 2 years. And in October of 2009, 30 days, for a 30-day period, my legal bill for that 1 month was $476,000. So you tell me, if I can't get justice, if I can't fight the system, how do the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people that are far less fortunate, how do they do it? They can't. And that's the thing that the public doesn't get. That's the thing that the public doesn't see. And as far as how we educate them, I think this forum is one thing. And this book is one thing. And that is the sole purpose of what I'm trying to do now. I've created a 501c4. It's called the American Coalition for Criminal Justice Reform, ACCJR.org. And my whole function behind this is to educate the American people and make them go to their legislators and call for change. Because at the end of the day, what the Heritage Foundation and all these advocacy groups that are out here fighting for change and fighting for reform, if you don't fight to change the laws, we're going to be doing this 30 years from now, doing the same exact thing. The laws have to change. And the more the public knows about what goes on within the system in reality, the more they're going to fight for change. Because I promise you, if the American public and our legislators saw what I saw and witnessed what I witnessed, there would be anger, there would be outrage, and there would be change. Now the mission is to get them to see it.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Did you get any new or different perspective after you got to know Jack Abramoff? Or maybe, I don't know if you knew him beforehand, but also, did you have any speculation or theory about the arrest that led to the death in the van in Baltimore, and then the 6 police officers that have been accused? Do you have a sense of what they're going through now?
Two things. On the Jack side, I knew Jack by reputation before I met him, actually in prison, Jack Abramoff. I found him to be charismatic, funny. I used to tease him, say he could be a stand-up comedian if he couldn't find a job. He was a nice guy. You know, I didn't. You know, I read all the stories. I read some books about what he was accused of, what he was convicted of. You know, I didn't know anything about him other than what I read. On the Baltimore case, I can tell you this. Going through what the Baltimore police officers are going through, you know what? Forget the Baltimore cops for a second. Any one of you, anybody in this audience, if tomorrow morning someone called you and they handed you a criminal indictment against you, that indictment says the United States of America versus, and it would have your name on it. You are now in a fight for your life. I don't care what the indictment's for. I don't care if it's for manslaughter, murder, tax evasion. I don't care. I don't care what it's for. It is a fight for your life because once you're convicted, you are no longer a fully empowered U.S. citizen. Don't ever forget that.
Hi, Bernie. Neil Franklin from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. So you mentioned some of the things that, what you're trying to do as far as asking citizens to go to their representatives and advocate for this reform. And obviously your book is one of these educational tools to assist with that. Are there any specifics regarding policy reform, any type of policy reform that you would advise on advocating for? What would some of those specifics be? Any particular pieces of legislation?
I think there are four things that I would focus on. First, the mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines. Secondly, for the legislators to look at how we incarcerate the mentally ill and addicted and what we do with first-time, low-level nonviolent offenders in the drug world. Third, programs, real programs that teach life improvement skills, vocational skills, things of that nature, things that will really help reduce recidivism that can be monitored and tracked, and there could be accountability within those programs. And lastly, the fourth, and probably the most important, is the removal of your conviction. At some point, you have to pay your debt to society. I get it. But your debt to society shouldn't last eternally till the day you die. Only in the most extreme cases should that happen. There is a reason for prison. Prison is a punishment. I get that. You take bad people that do bad things, you put them in prison. Some are there for a long time, some are there forever. I understand that. But for others that do their time, they serve their probation, and they get back into society, or they're trying to get back into society to be a successful citizen, get rid of the conviction. Get it off their record. Do something that helps them, give them back their civil and constitutional rights. Because as it stands today, they are a second-class citizen until the day they die, no matter how good they are and how good they become afterward.
Hi, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I have a quick question. I believe that there is selective prosecution, but also the DOJ. It's too political, and maybe I'm wrong, and please correct me. But when we look at some people, like maybe Jimmy Haslam, who gets to pay a $92 million fine, his company, $1 billion, in I think $32 billion a year, and some people like you and others do jail times, like a different issue, but like John Kerik, he went to jail, he was denied his halfway house time. And it just seems like there's some selective sentencing And also the politicalization. I mean, the DOJ is appointed by the president. And any comments you have would be fantastic.
Anyone that thinks that there is no selective or political prosecution in this country, you've got to be really naive or stupid. That's what I think. And that's a reality. Look, prosecutors, and I want to make this clear, I've worked with some of the best, in my opinion, some of the best United States attorneys in this country. I've worked with some of the best state prosecutors in this country. I ran one of the most substantial drug investigations in New York history that were prosecuted through state and federal organizations, and worked with some of the best people I've known in law enforcement. But keep in mind that prosecutors, their performance evaluation is based on their conviction rates. A prosecutor's performance evaluation is based on the positive press for their office. You know, for anybody to think that, you know, there's not selective prosecution, I just think you're really naive. On the sentencing issue, I have to tell you, I don't have a problem with people that are involved in white-collar crimes, that, you know, we punish them by making them pay restitution and pay fines, double their fines, do whatever. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think everybody has to go to prison to pay for their mistakes. It's sort of like, you know, you get a parking violation. You're going to pay the summons, you're going to do 30 days in jail. Okay, I'm not saying the same thing for white-collar criminals, but I can assure you there are many white-collar criminals, white-collar people that were convicted of things that they didn't even know they did anything wrong. There was no criminal intent, but we put them in prison. You know, I just think it's wrong. And these things have got to be fixed over time.
Paul Kamenar, Washington, D.C. attorney. Your message does seem to be getting some bipartisan support at the presidential candidate level. You have candidates from Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, to Hillary Clinton. Obviously, you think this issue should be discussed more at the national level. Would you be reaching out to any of these candidates, and how do you think this issue should be on the national agenda?
What's your first name?
Paul Kamenar.
Paul, here's what for the last year and a half, and right up until the time I created this coalition, I have met with just about every member of the House and Senate Judiciary, or their staff, or their counsel, pushing this issue. I strongly believe that in the 2016 presidential election, criminal justice reform has to be one of the top 5 domestic issues on the next president's plate, whoever that president is. The system as it stands today is unsustainable financially. We see state governments around the country that are really aggressively engaged in criminal justice reform, doing tremendous work. Look, Texas, the law and order capital of the world, if they can get involved in criminal justice reform, close down prisons, create alternatives to incarceration, and do the things they're doing, then every other state in this country can do it. Most importantly, the federal government has to follow suit, and here's where you're going to have the problem. In those state governments, every one of them lives by a budget. They get a certain amount of money, they have to live within the budget. I ran the NYPD, I had a $3.2 billion budget. When I ran Rikers Island, I had nearly a $1 billion budget. Okay, if I run out of money, where's it going? Who's giving me money? Nobody's giving me the money. I have to live within my budget. The problem we have in the federal system, they just print more money. That's a problem. So we really, the legislators, the judiciary, the next presidential candidates, I'll be going down to South Carolina, I'm going to Iowa, I'm going to go to New Hampshire. I'm going to talk to the caucus groups. I think it's extremely important that they know how important this issue is so that they can create the debate. So when those candidates show up, we should be asking, what are you going to do about this?
Ethan Simpetis. I am one of Bernie's attorneys and know his issues very intimately. I apologize for getting here late, but I know his story quite well. And I think for your audience, if I may, I'll just point out a couple of things that you could comment on. One, I believe one of the reporters commented on selective prosecution. And my point would be for you to discuss, what about excuse me, abuse of discretion of the prosecutor? You were in jail. There were individuals, you heard Jack Abramoff being discussed. There are other individuals who don't have the headlines or the name recognition, who you know personally suffered greatly at what many of us would consider, and when I say many of us, on the outside, just ask a reasonable person, the fisherman case, and I don't know if you discussed that at all before.
Yeah.
That's one. Two, regarding the constitutional rights, when you were being tried in your criminal case, if you could share the freedom of speech, your right to free speech, and how that was curtailed, if you believe so.
Yeah, I don't want to get into my whole case because I want you to read the book. For those of you that don't know, I was initially, I was brought up on charges, New York City ethics charges. There was a New York State Bronx grand jury investigation, lasted for 18 months. 18 months, a really thorough grand jury investigation. At the conclusion of that investigation, the Bronx district attorney basically concluded that I had violated two ethics violations. One, that I didn't put something on a conflict of interest report, a personal loan. That was an ethics violation. And two, that I had accepted gifts in the form of renovations from somebody that was attempting to do business with the city. And they went before a judge, state judge, and they said that there was no quid pro quo between me and the contractor. In other words, I didn't do anything for the contractor, for him to, or the contractor's recommended contractor to do anything for me or my apartment. And I had to pay a $221,000 fine. $221,000, nearly $250,000. I paid that fine. I was told it was over. Investigation's over. You and your family can go on with your life and live happily ever after. That's what I was told by my attorney, and I was told that by the prosecutor. That lasted for several weeks until I woke up one morning to the news that the federal government had initiated an investigation around the apartment renovations and my nanny. The nanny tax had already been paid. The penalties had been paid. And the apartment renovations had been dealt with in the Bronx. I went through another 9-month, 10-month, 12-month grand jury investigation federally. And they brought federal charges for the same exact thing that I had already resolved. You know, it's a strange world. I'll leave it at that. And one last thing Ethan said. Freedom of the press. Listen, I'll give you a little advice. You get indicted by a federal prosecutor, by any prosecutor. If you get indicted, the whole freedom of the press thing is a joke. You're not allowed to talk to anybody. Don't talk to anyone. Because if you do, somebody's going to say that you're attempting to influence the jury pool. That happened to me. They said I was attempting to influence a jury pool about an email that was sent to the Washington Times that no one ever saw. No one saw it. But every day, ironically, every part of my case, every part of the investigation, everything that was going on in the grand jury was leaked to the press. I didn't leak it because I didn't know it, but it was being leaked to the press every day. That's okay. I say one thing, you're attempting to influence the jury pool. It's sometimes it could be an unfair system. Thank you.
Great discussion, great book. Thank you.